players gather to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most powerful in the history of Magic the Gathering. Llanowar Elves, Quirion Ranger, and Elvish Herder. Wait, seriously? These are Oh, Nadu, not again. Battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind BoshNRoll on YouTube, Thraben University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by 3-for-1 Trading and Sparks Law Practice.
Hello, and welcome to episode 132 of the Eternal Glory podcast. Reanimator is banned. Long live Reanimator. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. As always, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU.
I am Brian Coval, aka BoshNRoll.
And I am Bryant Cook, who is not BoshNRoll.
Really? Since when? Because we get confused all the time. I don't know if I mentioned this on the pod, but a CEDH tournament I was at about 2 or 3 months ago, I had a really nice long conversation with someone. They were like, I really appreciate everything you do. And oh, cool. Yeah. And we were just back and forth. And at the end, they were like, yeah, I've been playing your deck in Legacy. And I was like, which one? And they looked at me like I was stupid. And they were like, the Storm deck, your deck. And I was like, oh, that's Bryant. But, thank you for all the nice things you said. They apply to me too, I hope.
Love that.
Anyway, shout out to all our new Patreon and YouTube members. We've got Sean S., Ivan S., Liam H., Mulch H., Glenn B., and a belated shout out to friend of the show, Tony Scapone, who actually joined a long time ago. And there was one random month, like last year, where Patreon wasn't displaying our new members. And we were just like, yeah, shout out to all of you. We love you. We can't shout you out. Apparently, Tony was in that class and wanted his shout out. We got you, Tony. Thank you for supporting the show.
Speaking of supporting the show, this episode is brought to you by Sparks Law, a business transactional law firm owned by Eternal Magic community member Jonathan Sparks. If you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or gig worker looking to start your own company, Sparks Law can help with partnership agreements, contract reviews, intellectual property protection, or any other business legal questions. If you want to shape your business strategy with a fellow Eternal gamer, reach out via email to jsparks, that's JSPARKS, at sparkslawpractice.com, or call 470-268-5234.
And if you would like to advertise to over 10,000 plus Eternal gamers every single episode, reach out to us. We're always accepting new sponsors.
We're going to start off this episode. The topic is going to be the recent ban update where Grief was banned and Psychic Frog was not. We're going to talk about the first week and a half or so fallout since then. And we have a Patreon question from user Dragon Day Dragon, who asks, what are your thoughts on the new BNR schedule? That is almost the topic of the episode anyway, so you're going to get a lot more than you asked for, but specifically the schedule, not the update itself, but the change from updating the ban and restricted announcement window from coinciding with set releases. Now it coincides with PTQ seasons. What do we think about this, gentlemen? Brian, let it rip.
I am not in love with it. So I think that there's a lot going on here. So the big thing is they felt like they didn't have enough data or time after a set release to make changes. So they've pushed it back, and now we're going to have about 4 months worth of time, which is great for data, but bad if something is obviously broken. And I think that's sort of the issue. So let's think about Underworld Breach being released in Theros Beyond Death. So if that's released, but your PTQ season already started, you now have to ride out the rest of the PTQ season with Underworld Breach legal. And that could be 3+ months because they're every 4 months now. And we just had to be in our update where all three of us on the podcast said we believed that Psychic Frog needed to go. So our next BNR update is December 16th, which is after all of the Eternal weekends. So that means that Psychic Frog is legal for all of them. And if it's an issue, it's a big one.
I think that if Wizards of the Coast does their job with managing bans for formats properly, then knowing when to expect changes to the format is, generally speaking, an acceptable thing. However, historically speaking, with Legacy, there have been a lot of misses, and we have spent many, many, many episodes talking about how cards need to be ejected from the format. We did it for Oko, we did it for Ragavan, we did it for Dreadhorde Arcanist, we're doing it now for Psychic Frog, and knowing that the feel bad period is going to last for 4 months with no possible emergency bans to manage the format feels pretty bad. I am generally, at this time, unhappy with the current model. I understand it. I don't know that this model works well for Legacy, which will never be tied to things like PTQ seasons.
Yeah, Phil mentioned something that we didn't mention in the setup, which is that in the announcement, they also planted a flag that emergency bans are not going to be normal. Like the idea of an emergency ban, it better be a real freaking emergency. And they've already indicated through their behavior that Nadu was not deemed an emergency. So if Nadu in Modern is not an emergency, what is? So that's what Phil was saying there, if you didn't read that full announcement. As far as my thoughts on the schedule itself, I think that Legacy being not attached in any way to the PTQ circuit I don't think the cadence or the timing matter that much to us in the Legacy format. As somebody who has been playing RCQs the last few seasons and just making the minimum possible effort to try to do that, it is super weird and shitty that we had to play half the season with Nadu legal in Modern, and now there's going to be half a season where it's not, where people are going to have to completely just shred their decks and try something new, or they had to queue suboptimal decks into Nadu for a couple weeks knowing that it would be different one day, or whatever, like rebuild their sideboards. That's really bad, and I do think that's generally a good change. I also like how this gets us out of the circle jerk of, well, a new set just released, we want to see some data before we take action. And if the ban update is tied to a new set release, that's always going to be the case. So I like that that's a separation. As far as it being every 4 months instead of every 3, that could leave some things lingering longer than we want. But hopefully they'll take this opportunity to get real data detached from new set releases shaking things up to make better decisions. And like Phil said, hopefully they make good decisions so we don't have to sit for those extra months with cards that should obviously not be in the format.
There was a weekly MTG that featured Carmen Handy and Dan Musser, who are Wizards of the Coast employees, where they fielded questions and stuff like that, some from the host and then some from Twitch, where they went through the thought philosophy of Wizards B&R, not only for Modern but Legacy, and they really went through and explained like how they came to the decision to unban Mind's Desire, for example. And I think if you're interested, you should go check out that weekly MTG, because it was pretty eye-opening on how some of the stuff behind the door works, because there's a lot of people on Twitter that are like, ban this, ban that, and getting to see a little bit of what goes on at Wizards helps inform you of what you should expect in the future rather than screaming into the void.
So with that, let's go ahead and launch into our main topic. So we have now had a decent number of smaller tournaments where Grief has been banned, and we are going to kind of skim over data and results from 5 of these. 4 MTGO challenge from throughout the last week, and then 1 Japanese event, one of the KMC events at Hareruya. And I guess let's start with a 56-player MTGO challenge. This was a middle of the week one, 8/28. Won by Eldrazi Aggro. Nothing too exciting about that list. 1 Psychic Frog deck in the top 8. 4 more Psychic Frog decks in the top 16. So 5 of your top 16 decks are just 4x Psychic Frog decks as a starting point here. 2 Eldrazi decks notably in that top 8.
And in the top 8, there are 3 Eldrazi, 1 Painter, 1 Mystic Forge. So that's 5 Ancient Tomb decks in the top 8, where we had been, and we're going to try to make this a linear thread as the week goes on and people get information, because we've been saying for months on this podcast, and other people have been saying elsewhere, Eldrazi is a very powerful deck that is being held slightly back by grief, and Eldrazi is a great place to start in a new format. We've been saying Painter is a great place to start in the new format. You get to play so many Red Blast main that you could just pick off frogs left and right, and you have a combo kill of your own versus faster decks. And this day one, basically first big event, we see a ton of Ancient Tombs, we see Painter, we see a Mystic Forge combo deck just trying to send it, which is also an Eldrazi deck, let's be serious. Kozilek's Command, Glaring Fleshraker. It's not Eldrazi aggro, but there are 4 top 8 decks that feature Eldrazi cards. And then Reanimator, no frog, just actual Reanimator with World Gorger Dragon, second place. That could be someone farming the Grief Spanned, we don't need to worry about graveyards anymore, hype train, and just walking through that gap. And then Misplaced Ginger, the streamer, playing a non-Reanimator frog deck is the rest of the top 8. And then there was Blue 8 X Control. This looks like, this is a Days Undoing Narset Jeskai list. And that's your top 8 of the first event.
So a couple things here that I want to pull upon. Number one, still no consensus Eldrazi deck list. If you do like a Moxfield compare or something like that over these Eldrazi aggro decks, there's some considerable changes. Some of them running spells like Once Upon a Time, some of them playing a Null Drifter, some of them playing like 3 Null Drifters, some of them playing It That Heralds the End, some of them not. Still, people are unsure how to build that deck. Second thing that I want to pull upon here is that non-frog Reanimator appears to be a viable archetype in some capacity, and I'm going to keep pointing it out as it appears throughout this results. As I was compiling these tournament results for this, I was surprised how many times I was seeing it.
I would like to make quick note of something. So Justin Gennari posted this to Twitter, and Justin handles the vintage data collection. And there was a talk about a certain deck top 8ing a certain amount. I don't remember exactly what it was, but Justin pointed out that if you actually look at top 16 data, you get a lot better of a more clear picture of what the story's telling you rather than only looking at top 8 data. And I think that's also something that we should consider with our discussion today. While there is only one frog deck in the top 8, there's plenty of them in the top 16. And this was a Wednesday evening challenge. And the fact that there's so many challenges now on Magic Online, so it's really less important to play a weekend challenge because there's more that are in other people's time zones now. So you're going to see different decks in different time zones than you normally would to a couple of years ago, I guess. That's my point here.
All right. Do we want to say anything else about the deck lists from this first event? There is one sort of oddball deck list at 12th place from Motown 4. That is a Mycosynth Gardens, Urza Saga, Phyrexian Dreadnought, Broadside Bombardiers, Minsk and Boo, the One Ring amalgamation that is relatively interesting. Lots of fast manas, including 8 Spirit Guides, 3 Mox Diamonds, 3 Chrome Mox. That list caught my eye for being just different.
That list caught my eye because on MTG Top 8, we're reviewing these things. The display image is Gemday Tome. Did you guys catch that?
I did.
Every other deck, it's like Thought-Knot Seer into Mystic Forge, Beta Servant, Psychic Frog, like actual cards in the deck. And I was like, oh, who's playing a Gemday Tome? Turns out it's not. It's just a different weird deck. And this is the image that was chosen. I don't know what's going on there, but clickbait.
Phil mentioned the Reanimator decks, and I'm happy that non-frog Reanimator is allowed to survive now. But I do know that both of the players in this top 16 are also just Rakdos Reanimator diehards. Like, they were always going to play this deck no matter what. I don't think that this is a shift in people switching as much as these people now can see some success without grief, discard your Gristlebrand, reanimate your Gristlebrand.
Unmask is coming back. And I have seen some Dance of the Deads and some Shallow Graves recently. Neither card I had seen for a hot minute.
The only reason to play Dance of the Dead is if you have World Gorger Dragon. That's just not a on par removal or a reanimated spell with our format. So that is Specifically, there is a World Gorger Dragon in this list, and World Gorger Dragon can generate infinite mana and then loop infinite Archon of Cruelties or loop Atraxa until you find the Archon of Cruelty to start looping that. So there are combo outs for Dance of the Dead, which is important. And also important, no exhumes in any of these lists. I think that card is kind of unplayable at this point, because if the frog decks just discard Atraxa in response to your exhume, that's really bad. So we might be in a post-exhume world.
This one might be for a Bryant question. Is there a reason to play World Gorger Dragon over Abdel Adrian?
Well, World Gorger Dragon can flicker your Underground Mortuary, which allows you to surveil Gristlebrand into the graveyard or Atraxa or Archon of Cruelty. As far as I know, Abdel is only non-land permanent, so you don't get that interaction.
Right. You don't get infinite mana unless you have a mana rock, and you don't get infinite surveils, Abdel, but you do get infinite 1/1s.
Got it. Okay. All right. Anything else we want to say about this first challenge here?
I think we're ready to roll.
All right. So let's go on to challenge number 2. Date listed as 8/31. There's 2 of these on MTG Top 8 that are listed as 8/31 challenges. I believe this 51 player one is the Friday one, but I can't say that with certainty.
I believe it's the Saturday morning.
Well, JK. So, whatever it is, whenever it was, we have 2 Psychic Frog finishes in the top 8, 4 more Psychic Frog decks in the top 16. So that is 6 of the top 16 decks here being Psychic Frog decks. Notably, in these results, we have 2 more non-Frog Reanimator lists, 3 Eldrazi finishes, and overall, this was an incredibly strong day for blue-black decks.
Our friend playing World Gorger Dragon actually took first place in this event, took second place in the previous one. So they really know how to flicker their Underground Mortuaries to top finishes. Shout out to Magic Online user Rude Slay. And then again, in 5th to 8th place, we have Snoopy Magic, another just diehard Rakdos Reanimator player. Here you are seeing Shallow Grave and Faithless Looting, even 2 copies of Exhume. So they're definitely on a more classic Rakdos Reanimator shell than the previous one.
They also have a card that I love in Ripples of Undeath. I see Phil nodding emphatically. He and I are on the same wavelength tonight. Ripples of Undeath, relatively new card from MH3. 1 and a black enchantment, beginning of your main phase, mill 3, then you could pay 1 mana and 3 life to get one of those 3 cards from your graveyard to your hand. So it's kind of like a Sylvan Library. It's kind of like just, random graveyard self-mill fueling stuff. And I have been loving this card in shells like Pox that really needed something to do exactly this. And Reanimator, you don't really want to end up in a game where Ripples of Undeath has to happen. If you're spending 2 mana and waiting a turn, you've already come off the rail somewhere. But it's cool that it's showing up here.
Yeah, so something interesting about these reanimation decks is that they're taking very different sideboard approaches. So the first place Reanimator deck, for example, has 4 Chain of Smog, 3 Duress, 4 Sedgemoor Witch, 4 Witherbloom Apprentice as the sideboard plan. So that's 8 cards that go infinite with Chain of Smog, and you can board out some amount of your Reanimator package when you are expecting your opponents to just bring in strong hate for it. And then if we look at Snoopy Magic's list, that has a pivot plan of Show and Tell, as well as a small man plan of things like Shouldered the Apocalypse, Magus of the Moon, and Douthie Voidwalker. So if your opponent finishes you quickly in game 1 and you don't see enough of their deck, you might not actually know what sort of sideboard pivot is coming.
Yeah, that is important. Also, difference in these lists. The Rude Slay list still has Troll of Khazad-dûm as a 3 of. It's playing 14 lands. And then the Snoopy Magic also has 14 lands, but no trolls. So there's already differences in these Reanimator lists. And I just want to shout out while we're talking about non-Frog Reanimator, one of the big conversations that we and the rest of the Legacy community were having during the Something's Gotta Go from the Rescaminator shell era is Entomb was banned in Legacy at one point. Maybe it should go back if that is the thing actually breaking the shell versus Grief, which fair mid-range Grief decks are kind of interesting in their own way. And Entomb Reanimate is its own busted thing that's interested in its own way, and where Wizards of the Coast wanted to apply pressure to break up the shell was really up to them and how they want to manage the format, and them leaving the big splashy legacy thing legal and banning the kind of annoying MH2 thing kind of tells us where their head is with how they're going to break up shells where there's a new card and an old card both causing a problem together.
So one thing that I thought notable here was in 3rd/4th place, we actually have an initiative deck list, specifically a red-green one. Magus of the Moon, Blood Moon effects are something that we identified as like very clearly being good against Eldrazi. So if you are playing a deck that can hyper consistently Magus of the Moon on turn 1, that is something very powerful to help you out with your Eldrazi matchup. And you can have 3 or 4 more Blood Moons in the sideboard if you would like. But now that Grief is not a part of the metagame, you are not as worried about losing to your own Caves of Chaos Adventurer or Undermountain Adventurer or Seasoned Dungeoneer being reanimated on turn 1 from your opponent. So maybe initiative comes back a tiny bit.
Well, spoiler, I just recorded with Froginator before we jumped on this call to record the pod. I 5-0'd easily. 2 of my opponents were on initiative, and I Thoughtseize reanimated the shit out of them. So this is part of that like linear thread that we're trying to tie here of, oh good, Rescaminator's gone. We can do stuff like initiative again to 5 events a week later. Maybe not. And I think our next event will really start tying the room together on what this format is still kind of about.
Looking at the other 3rd, 4th place list is Dimir Reanimator, and I was like, okay, let's see how many Psychic Frogs are here. So there are 4 copies of Psychic Frog, but that is not the interesting thing to me about this list. So Phil mentioned Abdel Adrian. It has that in there, so they can create an infinite number of 1/1 creatures. Okay, that's cool, I guess. But then that's not even the most weird card to me. It's actually Generosent, the green troll of Khazad-dûm, which, I mean, this card is a pauper staple. So I was like, ooh, Generosent, why are they playing green? Search it up and down the main deck, nothing there. When you look in the sideboard, you see Carpet of Flowers. So this person is teched out for the mirror match. And then on top of that, they have Veil of Summer. So they're really looking at green as a way to break open the mirror match and really shove through and protect your Psychic Frogs. So I think that's pretty interesting. And then if you jump down to 10th place, you see a more stock, Dimir list, the 4 Psychic Frog. You see the addition of Tamiyo, Inquisitive Student, 1 Atraxa, 1 Archon of Cruelty, and they're playing the 2 Tamiyo to circumvent the loss of Grief, but then there's 2 copies of Thoughtseize. So pretty easy swaps there, and it looks like Dimir Reanimator is live and well.
I would love to talk about Tamiyo for just a second. So I don't remember if it's on the pod or in a video that I recorded. One thing that I talked about is that Tamiyo is a really strong turn 1 play right now, because Tamiyo is kind of an annoying legacy card in that it doesn't really do anything immediately, but you kind of need to answer it immediately, or it accrues card advantage for when the game goes long or transforms into something that you will have a harder time answering with many decks. And the result of you answering a Tamiyo is sometimes that you don't get to answer the Psychic Frog that follows up. And so I mentally had been viewing Tamiyo as removal bait for Psychic Frog. And then I saw a tweet from Pokimoki, who is known for playing these slower, more controlling piles, who essentially was thinking about the cards the other way, where he was like, yeah, Psychic Frog is the thing that I want to get removed so that I keep the Tamiyo around.
It's interesting, Phil. So you were talking about how the play patterns of Tamiyo work, where it accrues card advantage for later, and then you have this ultimate Planeswalker on the back half. And I think that's honestly just great design. Like, we've complained about Ragavan, Dreadhorde, and now Psychic Frog being too snowbally with their initial effects. Tamiyo is what I think we'd like to see more of, where it's not super impactful immediately, but in the mid to late game can take over, even though it's a 1-drop. Like, that's just good design to me.
Yeah, 1 mana, 0 power flyer in Birds of Paradise. Perfect design. Garfield did it right the first time. Tamiyo living up to the hype. That's just a very cool thing that it took some of us a while to realize is even good, much less possibly a staple moving forward. And one thing that I really want to share with the world because when I realized it, it immediately shifted how I think about Legacy right now. The Dimir Tempo decks, the non-Reanimator Frog decks, they're playing Tamiyo and Nethergoyf as 4-ofs. And Nethergoyf is a 1-drop that hits you for a bunch of damage. Tamiyo is a 1-drop that draws cards slowly over time. Neither of them you really want to sink your first removal spell into because Psychic Frog hits you for damage while drawing cards over time. But if you let your opponent have Nethergoyf and Tamiyo because you're saving your removal for Psychic Frog, they have already created Psychic Frog in the aggregate by hitting you for a big chunk of damage and drawing an extra card every turn. And these decks with 4 Goyf, 4 Tamiyo, 4 Frog kind of have 6 Psychic Frogs in them. And if you're not thinking about it correctly, you're going to get got.
Did you just moneyball us?
I did, yes.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, so there have been a decent number of games that I've recorded in the last week or so where I'm just like, I cannot play around days in this spot because if I fall behind on curve, it is just disastrous because my opponent is accumulating clues with every, turn that I wait, or they are getting closer to ultimating a planeswalker that is already in play, or even something like a Borrowgoyf that we're sometimes seeing in these decks, like has a chance to swing. And I'm just like, okay, if I am ever going to get my own game plan going around all of my opponent's card advantage, I have to cast a spell right now. And it just sucks. Days is really good right now.
Man, Phil, you just set off like half of the Legacy community. There's a lot of people out there that think we're in too much of an agreement with Wizards of the Coast not being anti-Days. And I think Days is actually a good thing about Legacy. And I think there's some mix-up. Like there was an article that I read about how Days protects Legacy from all the broken combo decks. I'm not sure if that's actually true, but I do think Days is actually really important with some of the mid-range wars and making sure that some of the 3-drop planeswalkers aren't impactful in Legacy. Things like Teferi, for example, can be a little bit unfun, but they're less punishing when you can daze it and things like that. So I do think Daze is healthy for Legacy, and I think that it's a play pattern that defines the format too, and we can't forget about that.
The only time that I don't like Daze is when it is just not possible to play around it. And I feel like the Ragavan era, the Dreadhorde era, it was just like, no, you have to try to cast those spells before they connect with this thing once. And I kind of feel like we're back there with Psychic Frog again.
I would agree with that.
All right. Do we have anything else we want to say about this second challenge here?
I just want to point out one new card from Bloomborough that has shown up in lists. It's Fell, F-E-L-L. 1 and a black sorcery, destroy target creature. It's just murder for the cost of Doomblade if you're willing to kill the thing at sorcery speed. And I think this is the cheapest destroy target creature, no limitations that's been printed. And obviously not being an instant's going to hurt you sometimes, but sometimes go for the throat, just not going to kill the random artifact creature you happen to be up against the brew. So it's interesting that Fell has found its way into Legacy decks as a one-off so far. But it does kill Frog, and you generally don't need to kill that as an instant unless you're trying to get them to sink their hand in combat and then blow them out. But generally, you're just happy to have the Frog dead.
3-for-1 Trading is one of Europe's leading the Magic the Gathering traders. Their online shop has a fantastic selection of high-end Magic cards, especially for vintage, legacy, and old-school players. You can find them at shop.3for1trading.com or visit their booth at major events. They will run weekly sales, and new, individually scanned high-end cards are added every Wednesday. Use code Eternal Glory to get our community-exclusive offer of free worldwide shipping on your first order over $500 and experience their world-class customer service and exact grading for yourself. Okay, so we have one more Legacy Challenge listed with a date of 8/31. And this was a 48-player event. 2 Psychic Frog in the top 8, 1 more in the top 16, 2 Eldrazi in the top 8, 1 more in the top 16. We see more copies of Non-Frog Reanimator, and a win from a Nadu deck.
One of the Psychic Frog decks is 4 or 5 color control. It's not just straight Dimir. There's one straight Dimir deck and then one doing a little extra. And this is an important differentiation. Still, Psychic Frog being the core engine of a deck is worth noting. In this deck, this is a Yorion strategy, and this is alongside Up the Beanstalk, which gives them 8 2-drop engines to deploy and to protect as the game goes along in this Beanstalk shell. But this is a very different thing. This is not a Daze deck. They do have Wasteland, but in decks like this, the Wasteland is more of kind of a surgical tool to deal with Karakuses or Dark Depths or whatever, or Urza Sagas, more than it is to screw them and bash with Psychic Frog. It's alongside Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath. Like, this is a very different thing despite containing Psychic Frog.
Yeah, this is a classic Honorog pile of like sweet card advantage stuff. Tamiyo is also in here. This is a Yorion deck list as well. 4 Carpet of Flowers in the sideboard, 4 Consigned to Memory, which is the 1 blue counter target triggered ability or colorless spell with Replicate that has been seeing a ton of play as an anti-Eldrazi sideboard card. This deck has a lot of inexpensive removal with Swords, Prismatic Ending, Terminus, Leyline Binding. There is a lot to like here.
And this is literally on ZD's list, and it's a very Anu deck. Just 4 Force of Will, 4 Force of Negation, 4 Plow, 4 just 4 of all the cards that he wants to cast, and enough lands to cast them. And then Yorion in the command zone. And the sideboard, like Phil said, is 4-4-3-2 on cards that are good in certain matchups. Anu has been sending this every time the format rotates or every time a new set comes out. This shell for, I basically feel like since Yorion was printed, this has been kind of his thing. And I'm not going to speak for Anzi. I didn't watch him stream this event. If he did stream it, I'm not sure if he actually believes this is the best thing to be doing or if this is content Anu and what people want to see from him. Because this deck honestly looks like a mess to me, but also it did top 8 an event and has a lot of powerful cards in it. So I don't know.
Speaking of decks that look like a mess, I love the deck that won. It is an all-in Nadu Winged Wisdom combo deck, and when these decks first debuted in Legacy, people were viewing them as like Force of Will Daze decks, and they still had Green Sun Zenith and sometimes Living Wish. Well, this one is more like elves than anything else. So it has 3 copies of Allosaurus Shepherd, Birchlore Rangers, Delighted Halfling, Elvish Herder. Most of you probably don't know what that is. It's a 1-mana 1/1 elf with pay a green, target creature gains trample until end of turn. So that is a Green Sun Zenith target that you can then use to target Nadu or other creatures. We have an Elvish Visionary, Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, Endurance, 4 copies of Llanowar Elves, whoa, Nadu Winged Wisdom, Noble Hierarch, 4 Nomads Encore, Quirion Ranger, 4 Springheart Nantuko, and a Sylvan Safekeeper, followed by 4 Court of Calling and 4 Green Sun Zenith. There's some lands in there like Gaia's Cradle and, typical elves-like lands, but this isn't a deck masquerading as a blue deck. This is just like creature combo.
This is the modern deck grown up into the Legacy card pool. A lot of the Legacy Nadu decks we've seen up to this point, they kind of want like 3 or 4 creatures in play when the Nadu and the Nomad are assembled, and then they draw 8 immediately, pass the turn, draw 8 again, and that's overwhelming enough that they will win somehow. This is full Nadu combo. The modern decks, the way they were iterated on by the end of that format, they could loop infinite mana. They could pass the turn with infinite creatures in play. Once you have a Springheart Nantuko bestowed onto an Endurance, you could put your whole deck in your hand. There is a Boseiju who endures. There is not a Otawara, so they don't have quite all the combos, but the modern shell, once you have infinite mana and your deck in your hand, the modern deck could do things like copy Meddling Mage, naming every card legal in modern, pass the turn. Like that was a line that deck had, copying like 28 Sun Chasers versus Boros Energy, so you could never die. They would Otawara all their Springheart Nantukos, put them on the same creature. In case there was a Supreme Verdict, the Nantukos just fall off, then you fetch twice and you're still presenting lethal. All of these were loops in the modern deck, and exploring them more this way, like Springheart Nantuko is really the key to that stuff, and Endurance in the main. And this deck is doing that. I have not thought about it, so like on the fly, I might be thinking about this wrong, but I assume Elvish Herder goes infinite at some point, and it's not even asking much to do that. I assume Allosaurus Shepherd being pumped infinite times is a win con. Like if you just have one Llanowar Elves in play that can attack at the start of your turn, and then you poop out like Nadu thing, loop infinite mana, activate Allosaur Shepherd infinite times, untap it with Quirion Ranger in, like that's lethal. There's plenty of ways to go infinite here and actually end the game on the spot rather than just drawing 16 and saying that'll be good enough.
So one thing that's really neat about this deck list is that it is a Court of Calling deck list. And notably, we are used to these green mid-rangey combo decks as being able to green sun for green bullets. Court of Calling lets you get any creature. So the sideboard of this deck has one copy of Harbinger of the Seas. That is your Magus of the Moon, but for islands. So you could be playing this deck and all of a sudden just like, oh, Court of Calling, Harbinger of the Seas, all your fun Eldrazi mana is now gone.
Yes, that is the dirty trick I have seen Death and Taxes players do. Like End Step, Violin, Recruiter, grab Magus of the Moon off of exclusively planes that you've seen, and then they violin the Magus of the Moon and you can't play, and it's all uncounterable. This is the same kind of jam there. We've seen Reanimator decks Entomb Reanimate for Magus of the Moon rather than going for a bigger monster because they know that's good enough in certain matchups. And you can't respond. Once that chord for 3, once you pass priority on that, the Harbinger's in play. You don't get to float mana, you don't get to do anything. It's there. That is pretty sweet. Court of Calling has not been a legacy card in a long time. I'm excited to see it back.
Speaking of excited, second place list from Flost is a Life from the Loam deck with some Bloomburrow cards. It has Iridescent Vine Lasher. That's 1 black for a 1/2 with landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. And notably, it also has Offspring 2. So if you have a total of 3 mana, you can also make a 1/1 token copy of this, meaning that each one of your lands deals 2 damage to your opponent, and your fetch lands deal 4 damage to your opponent.
And Phil, let me tell you more, because I have been studying Standard, because I just played in a Standard Store Championship last weekend, and this is a combo there, the Vine Lasher plus Free Strider Lookout. Free Strider Lookout is a 3 mana 3/3, 2 and a G, with Reach from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Whenever you commit a crime, which is target anything your opponent controls or them, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, you may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, and then put the rest on the bottom in a random order. This ability triggers only once each turn. And you know what counts as a crime? Iridescent Vine Lasher. Take 1, trigger Free Strider Lookout, put another land into play, you take 1 again. And it is gated by this happens once per turn, but you play more than 1 Lookout. Where Legacy, so we have fetch lands, you could send it on your turn and on their turn. And this damage stacks up quick. And not just the damage, you're hitting land drops in your lands deck too. Like you 8-ball your opponent and put like 2 Urza Sagas, a Gaia's Cradle, and a Mazavith into play. That sounds pretty good to me.
And this is another Springheart Nantucko deck as well. Like that card is doing a lot of heavy lifting in Legacy alongside Gaia's Cradle.
Yes, there is a cool interaction that many of these decks feature that if you bestow Springheart Nantucko onto Dryad Arbor is both a land and a creature, which means copying it with Springheart Nantucko is a landfall trigger. And you could get these turns, especially with Gaia's Cradle involved, where you just play a land and then tap 10 mana, and then you have 5 more Dryad Arbors in play for the next turn, which then ramps the Gaia's Cradle, and then the next turn it's 10 new Dryad Arbors, and off you go. This is not a deck that you want to find yourself grinding into the mid game against. This deck looks like it might be soft to just getting their face reanimated or something like that, but I would not want to play against this with any of my Blue Soup, Island Ponder Keep kind of decks.
Notably, sneaking in at 15th place, there is a white-black energy deck list featuring the Guide of Souls Ocelot Pride engine that we did talk about in our previous episode.
And it has the Warren Soul Trader combo kill in it. It's got both.
So we see Mystic Forge again return in 3rd/4th place. Dimir Reanimator, pretty stock list just like the others in 3rd, 4th. More Eldrazi, Goblins in 8th place, and then a non-Dimir Reanimator in 9th. So that deck is, churning through. It looks like Fair Reanimator, Classic Reanimator is back. And then we see some Thassa's Oracle decks at the bottom of the top 16, like Doomsday Encephalid Breakfast.
And we got Geodude Jared coming in top 8 with Goblins. I've queued into Jared many times recently, and I'm like, man, I hope I get to play against Goblins right now. Not in a condescending way, but in a Goblins Rules kind of way. And the games are always interesting. So still making it work out there.
All right, why don't we go ahead and move on to our next challenge. Listed date is 9/1. This is a 54-player event with 3 Psychic Frog decks in the top 8, 2 more Psychic Frog decks in the top 16, Nadu decks in both second and third, and we do again see some non-frog Reanimator.
And this is the most recent one in our timeline so far, and it's the one with the most frogs. It seems like people are getting attuned to the metagame 4 major events in at this point.
Notably, this top 16 has 3 copies of Painter in it. We haven't talked about it so far, but there have been a little bit of Painter results sort of splattered in across the previous events as well.
Looking at the names from this event too, we're seeing a lot of similar names throughout the week as well. Like Shake Line was the person that won the day before on Nadu, and now they're back in 3rd/4th. The Nadu in second place is the deck list from the day before with a sideboard change. So it looks like people are studying the lists that are doing well, adapting them for the next stage challenge. So Legacy is churning is the message that I'm getting here.
Right, and that the non-frog Reanimator World Gorger deck was the same player in second and first. The Mystic Forge player was the same player in third and top 8. These are a lot of the same people bumping into each other. That will naturally select for itself. We're talking about the population of people who are A, available to play a full challenge on Magic Online during the week, B, interested enough to do it, C, brewers who want to be there on day one rather than wait a week and see how things shake out. I'm not surprised that I think the biggest of these events was 54, 56 was the biggest one.
56.
The smallest was 48. I don't have the full enrolled players list, but this could be 30 of the same people minimum, in all of them. So there is that. We are pulling from the same pool for most of this information. Our last event is a paper event in Japan, which we should see some different names in.
So a quick note, the first 5th through 8th list is Jesse Samick on Dimir Tempo. And I was just clicking around to see if I could find something unique here. And I think this is actually pretty damning. The Dimir Tempo deck is on main deck copies of Nihil Spellbomb post-ban. I know that it wasn't uncommon pre-ban, but this person has acknowledged that we're still in a Reanimator world. We're a week in, and this person's like, nah, main deck Spellbomb is still the correct move. There's Reanimator everywhere. So it does send a little bit of a message that Legacy needs to be prepared for these graveyard combo decks. Or, graveyard fair decks in a lot of the instances.
Yeah, so the Moon Stompy list in 8th place here has 4 Vexing Bobble main deck, 3 unlicensed Hearse main deck. That is very much pointing a finger at these various Dimir decks and Reanimator decks going I know Force of Will and Days still very much matter. I know the Graveyard very much still matters. The list was a little spicy, playing 3 copies of Cursed Mirror. 2 colorless and a red. It's a mana rock that taps for red, but you can have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield until end of turn, except it has haste. So that's something that can temporarily copy your initiative creatures, your broadside, your Goblin Rabblemaster, or maybe your opponent's Atraxa or their Troll.
Yeah, Curse Mirror has been kind of in and out of these shells as sometimes a 1 of, usually a 0 of. Seeing 3 is pretty exciting. But I'd also like to point out, despite the main deck Unlicensed Hearse, the main deck Nihil Spellbomb, the Painter with the main deck Soul Guide Lantern, the winner of this tournament was Blue Black Reanimator. It navigated this whole field in the hands of Mextortion and this list looks crazy clean. It's not doing any cute stuff. There's no Nihil Spellbombs. It's just the monsters, the creatures you'd expect. Fatal Push, Entomb, Daze, Force of Will, Cantrip, Slotsies. Boom. And that is, I just recorded with this deck, so it's fresh in my mind. I like that it has the combo gear. I like that the sideboard juke is still fully intact of cut all your reanimate things, bring in Orcish Bowmasters, Barrow-Goyf, Brazen Borrowers, that kind of thing. I like that that's all still there. I did really feel the lack of grief, though, in case it has sounded like we said the band didn't do anything. That's not true, because grief being that bridge between being a full send it combo deck and the top of the curve in a fair juke situation that also could still do reanimate stuff in a fair juke situation. Missing that matters. I also played a Dimir Tempo versus Dimir Reanimator matchup in that league, and them having stuff like 4 or 5 Nethergoyf, and they have way more Tamiyos than I do, and they have Baleful Strix that could get in the way of my frogs. It did feel like I was outmatched in the trying to play fair sideboard games from a deck construction level, because they just have more slots to dedicate to that sort of thing. I did end up getting away with it, but it was like game 3 came down to like I wasted their black source and they never had one. And I reanimated their frog and killed them with it, which is cheese mode. If they ever found black, they would have won. Like I did feel like versus the dedicated Dimir just good cards deck without the combo, I felt behind.
Okay, then why don't we go ahead and move to our final tournament, which was not on Magic Online. This was from a paper event in Japan, 67 players at Hareruya. 4 frog decks across the top 8, and we only have top 8 listed for this event. Notably, they are very different Psychic Frog decks, though. So there is a 5-color control in first place, a Dimir Tempo deck in second place, another Dimir Tempo deck in 5th through 8th, and then a Grixis aggro deck in 5th through 8th.
Yeah, the Grixis aggro deck is basically just your standard Grixis Delver. It's 4 Delver Secrets, 4 Dragon's Rage Channeler, 4 Psychic Frog, 3 Murktide Regent, Lightning Bolt, Mishra's Bauble. Like, this is just Grixis Delver. It's not anything too spicy. This is sort of the type of deck I would expect to do well post-ban. Like, right now we're seeing a lot of, blue-black Tempo and Reanimator still. But in my head, this is what I thought was going to be close to the top of the format post-ban. We're not seeing as much of it as we expected, but this is sort of what I thought would do well.
Notably, the removal split here in the main deck is 4 Fatal Push, 2 Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt does not kill Psychic Frog. Lightning Bolt's stock has gone down significantly. Like, again and again throughout this episode, it's just Psychic Frog, Psychic Frog, Psychic Frog, Psychic Frog. Your removal spells that don't answer that card have gotten so much worse.
And this might be a great mirror breaker. Like, you have access to Murktide Regent, which is a very large creature that plays well with Psychic Frog, because Psychic Frog can continually pump up your Murktide Regent. And if Fatal Push is the premier removal spell, it does not hit Murktide Regent. Plus, if you have the Red Splash, you have Pyroblast for that pseudo mirror match versus the Dimir Tempo deck. So I think it's pretty wise, but let's see if it, picks up in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, what I'm finding in my games and theory crafting is that the Pyroblast doesn't matter that much because Frog is killable by Fatal Push and cards like it that you could just put into Dimir, and stretching into a 3rd color to get Dragon's Rage Channeler when Nethergoyf exists, and trying to make something happen with like Unholy Heat or just play 2 Lightning Bolts in the case of this list. Is red worth it at that point? And I think there's more to say about, because the Dimir deck can also just play Murktide Regent, that you don't have to be Grixis to do that if you want to go over the top in the mirror. And we're looking at the sideboard, and it's Price of Progress, 3 Pyroblast, and 2 Meltdown are your red cards. Because I don't think Lightning Bolt's a reason to be red anymore. And I'm not even convinced Dragon's Rage Channeler is either. So really, Grixis, it's not whether this deck is good or bad, because it's clearly very good, but is the juice worth the squeeze on getting a 3rd color into your 19 land deck when you could just be Dimir?
Fair argument. My only thought there, and I'm not disagreeing with you, is that Dragon's Rage Channeler fuels the Psychic Frog jump as well as Murktide Regent, where in Dimir, you might be a little slower on getting your Frog online. You might not have, or your Murktide Regent online, and you might not have as much fuel for the Psychic Frog.
Right. DRC fueling Murktide definitely matters a lot. I don't think it matters with Frog, because Frog is, you mentioned Frog jumping, making Murktide bigger. Murktide has to be in play with enough food in the graveyard, then you start jumping for that to come up. And if you jump Frog early, you lose Delirium on Dragon's Rage Channeler. It might overtax, which brings me to there was a 4/5 color control deck. It's in first place, or at least reported in first place. Sometimes MTG Top 8 gets the standings after Swiss, and this is not actually who won the event, so I don't know. But we have a Beanstalk deck with 2 Psychic Frogs in it, which is something that I have kind of a wall that I've hit in my exploration as well, because Sultai Beanstalk, are we back? Do we just add frogs to the deck? Are we having a good time? And I found that in a deck like Sultai Beanstalk, Up the Beanstalk being fueled by delve spells when you also need your graveyard to jump frog, and Witherbloom Command no longer does anything in the format. Back at Eternal Weekend last year, Witherbloom Command was frequently killing a Up the Beanstalk at a Bowmaster, or killing something important, getting back your Wasteland, while fueling your delve spells, which keep the Up the Beanstalk happy. I think Up the Beanstalk and Psychic Frog might fundamentally disagree with each other. And this list that was first place, it has 2 frogs in it with 4 Beanstalks. It has 0 Murktides, 0 Murderous Cuts, probably as concessions to the fact that Frog is frequently graveyard hungry, and you can't really cast those cards. But then we're barely using Up the Beanstalk. We have 2 Lorien revealed, 4 Force of Will, 4 Leyline Binding that can trigger Up the Beanstalk in the whole deck, which seems kind of late to me.
2 Prismatic Ending, but that's sketchy.
Yeah, like if the game goes Omega long and you're just tapping 5 for a Prismatic Ending, you could get there. But Uro, Tamiyo, like a deck with 4 Tamiyo just doesn't feel like it also wants 4 Up the Beanstalk. I don't know. Maybe there's space to explore there, but my opinion right now, as of 1 week after these bans, is that Up the Beanstalk and Psychic Frog don't really belong next to each other, unless you're doing the Anu thing where you're just playing 4 of each and Yorion and always trying to do something on turn 2.
A quick note, the Nadu deck in 3rd place is just the Nadu deck that won the challenge with a couple sideboard differences. There's a card I've literally never seen before here that I'm sure Phil already knows by heart. Toxicrene?
Yep.
From, what is it? Warhammer?
Warhammer 40k.
For 3 and a green, you get a Tyrannid, which is a 2/4 reach with Death Touch. And then all lands have tap, add 1 mana of any color, and lose all other abilities. So that includes your opponent's lands. So there's some spice in the sideboard, but for the most part, it looks like this event looked at the results from the week. So as we spoke about earlier, about the format adjusting as the week went on, it continued to be true even for an event in Japan.
And this Toxicrene looks extra smart because there's a 12 post in this top 8 as well. And Toxicrene is something you can Chord or Zenith for that turns your opponent's lands deck into a bunch of 5-color lands that don't have other abilities. It's pretty cool.
Now, something that we see in these paper Magic results that I don't think saw in any of the top 16s on the Magic Online stuff is Death and Taxes. Notably, in paper Magic, you can play pre-war Formalware from the Fallout set. In case you're not familiar with that one, it is 2 colorless and a white for an equipment. When it enters, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield and attach this equipment to it. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and vigilance with an equip cost of 3. So if your opponent is trading their lightning bolts or their fatal pushes or whatever early for your stuff, be that like Stoneforges or Mother of Runes or White Orchid Phantoms, pre-war Formalware gives you some mid-game card advantage. And even if you don't equip it, it's something that can sit on the battlefield with the initial creature attached. It can be flickered with Yorion a little bit later on. That is a relatively large difference between paper and online Magic currently.
Also, obligatory, like, I hate the fact that we have 2 different formats. Like, online should be the same as paper. And if you're unable to get the license to put Fallout or Warhammer or whatever set on Magic Online, don't make it legal in Legacy. Like, we want the same format. And if you're not going to give it to us, find a different solution. Print these cards with different names. Sometimes, for example, cards will have like Ristic Study or whatever the new theme of the card is, but it's not actually a different card name. It's just Ristic Study with a different name. Do something like that. Give us access to these cards that we want.
Yep, definitely co-sign that idea. And Legacy, we did it. We got Warhammer, and then they immediately printed Fallout, which mercifully only really has pre-war Formalware as a card we might play, I think, for the most part. There's like Overburden, I think, is like another card that might be useful. I don't know. We're close.
I want Radstorm. I want it so bad.
Sure. Okay. Yep. Radstorm. But going back to this actual card, pre-war Formalware, playing a Stoneforge Mystic and tutoring pre-war Formaware is just checkmate versus somebody who let your Stoneforge Mystic resolve because they have Lightning Bolt or Fatal Push in their hand. As a 3-drop, you just cast it, you get back the Stoneforge, it's bigger, and then you tutor the Cauldron. So they have the option of just leaving the Stoneforge in play, where you could just zoot in pre-war Formaware on any other creature that you spend your removal on, or you could take your Medicine, kill that, and just deal with the next thing while Stoneforge is bigger. Just a very cool card for exactly this deck. I also tried it in some early prototype Nadu Stoneforge builds, but I think Nadu has fully gone past being an engine in a fair deck and should be played as a combo card at this point. But yeah, this card's dope.
I know that in our last episode, Brian wrote a love letter to Wrath of the Skies. Well, you're seeing it in the sideboard of Death and Taxes here. So historically, D&T plays something like Cataclysm or some other effect like that. Wrath of the Skies is interesting to me because it also gets rid of Aether Vials and stuff like that. Phil, do you have any opinion on Wrath of the Skies here?
That card has seen play in D&T for quite some time. It's really good in the artifact matchups in particular, where it can just kind of clean up everything that's going on with something like an Urza's Saga. I like Wrath of the Skies despite the tension that is present in the deck list, and I wouldn't worry about Aether Vial. Like, Aether Vial kind of sucks as a card. I'm generally of the opinion that card has mostly been power crept out of Legacy. You know, some decks like D&T and Goblins are still going to want to use it. But we talked a lot about Ancient Tomb today and not a lot about Aether Vial is all that I'm saying. So I think if you are casting a Wrath of the Skies and you lose your Aether Vial, your opponent is probably taking a lot more damage from that thing than you are.
I just want you to know I'm going to clip you saying Aether Vial sucks and put it into a folder.
No, that's fine. I am very strongly of this opinion and have been for quite some time. Like, it is very hard to want to be like the Merfolk gamer, the Goblins gamer, the D&T gamer in current Legacy. I don't feel like those decks have gained a lot over the last couple of years.
So all jokes and ragging on Phil aside, as far as cards that suck and have been power crept out, this Death and Taxes list features one Thalia Guardian of Thraben, and it's in the sideboard. Times have changed. Bryant is pumping his fist. He's going to have to change his daughter's name. This is a big innovation, and it's been replaced with Felia Exuberant Shepherd, and that can loop pre-war Formalware. It's got Flicker Wisp that can loop pre-war Formalware. This build actually looks like it's built heavily around pre-war Formalware as an engine, not just like a thing we could tutor for sometimes. This looks extremely intentional that this is very much the plan. And it has one copy of Containment Priest in the main, which is just exactly what I want in my deck, where I'm looping my permanents and not play and reanimating them like crazy. But Felia plus Priest is the old Eldrazi Displacer deletion method. But yeah, that Priest could be a little awkward if you don't have Felia, and it just shuts off a massive chunk of your deck. But it's in an 80-card deck as a tutor bullet for when you're going to want it, and hopefully it just works out for you.
Notably, since we didn't mention this is also a 4X Vexing Bauble deck list. Resolve your spells. And sometimes Aether Vial is not the best way to do that because the current format is relatively fast. Lots of Eldrazi, lots of Psychic Frog. You need to make your plays impactful. And Vexing Bauble into Stoneforge is very impactful as compared to Aether Vial into Stoneforge.
And this has been a meme since Yorion was printed, like the deck that needs Aether Vial on turn 1, adding 20 cards, LOL. Well, now if we count Vexing Bauble and Aether Vial as 1-drops that help your cards resolve, it just kind of generically, now they have a higher density of 1-drops to lead the game on than they did when they were a 60-card deck. And I mean, that's kind of cool, innovative deck building. I don't love Death and Taxes. I love playing against it. I feel like this is never a Magic Online deck and frequently a paper Legacy deck. As far as where those metagames diverge, I won't see Death and Taxes for like 4 months on Moto, and then I'll go to a local and 6 people out of 25 are playing it. That's kind of like the spot it's in these days, but you do need to be aware of how these decks are built, because if you are holding up removal for Thalia, you're going to be disappointed against this list.